today the topic we're going to discuss is about unlearning and deconstructing ourselves. Now, we have all lived our lives constantly thinking about learning and getting new knowledge, growing intellectually, gaining new skills, and more. This has been the direction of our self-development vision. And these have been our goals: gain new knowledge, gain new skills, grow, develop. But how often do we think about the whole notion of unlearning and deconstructing parts of ourselves that no longer serve us well, or worse still, have become liabilities in our lives? So, my dear friends, we'll take a few minutes today and just dive into this subject, because I think it's very important for us to, at least as a minimum, gain awareness of it. Now, each one of us, think of each one of us as being like a rock, and life is our sculptor. So you've got a rough piece of rock, and life sculptures us into what we become. And as we grow and gain knowledge, we use the events and learnings from life to transform from a rough rock to a refined sculpture. We all start as diamonds in the rough. When you've seen diamonds in the rough, they look valueless. But we complete life shining like the best of gems in the universe if we are so blessed. So today we are going to think like sculptors. We're going to stop thinking as, the mindset we have all had about life and the world. Let's think about sculptures today. And we're going to look at our sculpture in the making. So it's an inward look. And then we'll get our chisels out and hammers out and carve out the rough edges and the parts that deform our sculpture. This is what unlearning and deconstruction is all about. They are a process of self-refinement and enhancement. So how do we go about doing this? We have to start by making an honest inspection of our own sculpture. Now, we all like to think of ourselves as perfect. Very few people don't think of themselves perfect or always right. And how does this manifest in our so-called reality, this notion, this illusion of perfection? It leads us to believe in our ways of thinking. Secondly, we hold strong to our attitudes and opinions. Thirdly, we anchor ourselves deeply into our beliefs. Fourthly, we etch our experiences of the past deep into our beings and allow them to surface like triggers that drive our emotions, words, and actions. And fifth, we judge everyone else based on our own benchmarks. So these are 5 aspects about us that immediately come to mind when testing the makeup of our sculptures. And we'll talk a bit more about them. And there's lots more. But our goal today is to simply get started on the path of self-refinement through unlearning and deconstruction. So let us examine these 5 aspects a little more closely. Let's start with ways of thinking. So here, my dear friends, each one of us is a highly complex being, and no 2 beings are ever the same. So our differences at a material level are absolutely remarkable. Each one of us thinks very differently to the other. And this reminds me of the trip that an engineer took with his best friend, who was an MBA specialized in business, and these 2 young men go out camping. And the MBA is a bit of a philosophical guy, the engineer is a practical guy. And so they go out and they spend the day out, they pitch their tent, everything's in shape. They come back from their hike, and now it's nighttime, and they're looking at the sky. And the MBA guy is saying, Look at how beautiful the universe is. Look at the stars. Doesn't it make you feel like we are part of something so vast? And the engineer spends 5 minutes listening to this guy's discourse on the universe. And then he says, you know, I agree with all that, but I have another question. So the MBA asked him, what is it? He said, who stole our tent? So that's all he was thinking about. The fact that I can see the stars means someone's stolen our tent. And yet, so these guys saw very different aspects of the same situation. So this is a very simple example of different ways of thinking. And I'm sure each one of us is very familiar with the diversity of thinking that exists within our fellow beings. So I would ask the question, for example, do I think like the engineer? Or do I think like the MBA? Or do I think like something totally different? So many answers, but we have to find one that actually connects with us. So we can start testing our own way of thinking by listening to the different perspectives that our fellow beings offer us on a given situation. The more we listen, the broader the perspective we gain. Now, the golden word here is listening, and then considering, followed by deciding, and then finally adoption or rejection, or something in between. So in today's world, listening barely occurs, and hence there is very little consideration that actually follows. And this actually makes us live in our own little bubbles, in an intellectual vacuum. Therefore, our approach, especially as sculptors, is to listen, to consider, to decide and adopt or reject, or take the middle ground. So my dear friends, this process of identifying our ways of thinking is basically similar to an artist trying to gauge the color of his or her canvas. The only way to know the canvas is to see and digest how each color that is painted on it by others manifests. Your way of thinking is your canvas. How well do you know this canvas? That's our goal. As we become more conscious of this, we will be able to recognize our canvas better and better. We will also discover why so many colors don't resonate on our canvas. Because maybe our canvas is too dark, or it has more shades than is good for us. Most of us have complex shades and backgrounds in our canvases. If my canvas is dark blue, and you try to paint green color on it, which is your point of view, that green color, I won't see it. Because green and blue become black, it's too dark, I won't see your point of view. Hence, I will reject what you are trying to put forward, and you will perceive me as being close-minded. So here, my dear friends, a pure white canvas, which is completely neutral, gives all the colors the best expression possible. And that should be our goal, pure white canvas. A key step is to know your way of thinking. And that is to get to know your canvas, what it is projecting to others, and to yourself. Work on this and make your canvas more and more clear and neutral. It's a process that takes time, but it's a process that comes from a lot of inner search, introspection, being critical with the self. That's how we figure out exactly what our way of thinking is. And if we come close to that neutrality, we change our lives. Second is our attitude and opinions. Now this, my dear friends, is another big one. Our attitudes are so diverse, as are our opinions. And attitudes and opinions are learned. They are derived from what we see, hear, read, and are taught, or what we mimic of what others do around us. And in the days of communism, for example, the people were only exposed to information that the state showed them. So their opinions were cast in stone by the state. Their attitudes were totally shaped by the ethos of communism. Hence, they evolved into societies that were highly suspicious and unaccepting of any other ways. Now, democratic societies were no saints either. They fooled people into believing that they had a choice. But in essence, those choices were influenced or manipulated and governed via media and smart, repetitive messaging. If you hear the same thing over and over again, it becomes reality. And I learned that watching Donald Trump, because when it was something completely untrue, he said it enough number of times, everybody believed it. It became reality. So like the communists, democratic societies also shape the opinions and attitudes of the masses. One did it blatantly, the other did it subtly. So when I was growing up, we were taught that the communists were the bad guys, they were evil, from our history lessons in school to all the way till I became a young adult. Everything I read about, it always felt like that was a dark world. And that became our popularly accepted opinion. So I grew up believing in all this, and when I first visited Vietnam in the early 1990s, and these were the days when Vietnam was still under sanctions and embargoes, I went there to establish clean water infrastructure. And I remember on the flight there, my very first flight, I was apprehensive about what to expect because I had just seen boogeyman everywhere. However, I discovered that the people there were not demons. They were beautiful people and very kind. And I saw a lot of humanity in them, a lot of simplicity, more than what I had seen in other parts of the world. So I reshaped my opinions and attitudes from my new experience with these Vietnamese people. And I let go of all my biases because everything I had grown believing, what I was presented with was so different, but I was able to accept that and change the way I saw them, change my attitude, change my opinions. Now this, my dear friends, is how we unlearn and deconstruct. It's a simple example. You accept a change and then you go through with making it. If I had stuck to my opinions and my biases, I would have seen evil all around me, even if it wasn't there, because that's unfortunately how our minds work. But thank God for the blessing of intellect. I relied on my intellect to guide me in the unlearning process, in the deconstruction of my one-sided view of the world. So my dear friends, intellect is a powerful tool in our sculpturing process. To allow the intellect to lead, we need to be flexible and open to change. Flexibility and openness are two amazing types of chisels for a sculptor. Now, I picked the examples of the era of the Cold Wars so as to demonstrate this point, because we are all familiar with their history. But in reality, such opportunities for learning and unlearning appear before us in all the events of our lives, every moment. They come before us. Those of us who are open and flexible will emerge with more shine on their diamonds. Those of us who are rigid and dogmatic will remain unchanged at best, but conflicted at worst. So let us make the conscious choice to be open and flexible. Let us make the choice to keep shining our diamond consciously, on our terms. And one more point, which I have spoken about very frequently, is that we now have to be very discerning about what we see, hear, and believe, because we are living in an era of mass manipulation and with super convincing tools like AI. So we have to be very discerning. And once again, for that, defer to your intellect, because intellect sees beyond what is fake. It is our real compass of what is real. Therefore, let's start dwelling and drawing upon our intellect as much as possible. So follow your intellect with wisdom and discernment, flexibility and openness. I repeat that. Follow your intellect with wisdom and discernment, with flexibility and openness. That's the goal. And this brings us to number 3, which is beliefs, cultures, and traditions. Now, our beliefs, cultures, and traditions can be sources of great richness in our lives, but they can also be the most devastating weapons ever known. The key is to use our intellect to retain the good part of our beliefs, cultures, and traditions, and let go of the bad parts, which cause pain and suffering to ourselves, our loved ones, and our world. Let me give you an example of a terrible ancient tradition I wrote about in my book, Invoked. Invoked is a book that I was inspired with, which the story is based on a small town in Arabia in the year 600, before the coming of Islam and before the human transformation occurred through religions like Islam and Christianity and Judaism. And that part of the world was exposed to all three. So in the year 600, it's a story of the protagonist is the 13-year-old girl by the name of Amira, and the whole book is written through her eyes. And she is from a very poor family, and therefore is given to the richer families as a courtesan. Now, in this story, she encounters a very barbaric tradition where her role model, who was one of the leading women, young women of the time, from one of the leading families, Yasmin, gets married. And then she has a baby, and so throughout the 9 months, Amira is so bonded to the baby because she loves Yasmin very much and was looking after Yasmin. And when the baby is born, it was a girl. And in those days, in that tradition, they took the baby into the desert and buried the child. And she witnesses this, and she's completely shattered, heartbroken. And she calls out to the universe saying, this must change. And she invokes change. And that's how the whole story of Invoke begins to flow from that event. But this is an example of a primitive society with no education. Now, education builds our power of intellectual reasoning. Education builds our power of intellectual reasoning. So today, such practice has now almost disappeared. But I share it as an example of a toxic tradition. In India, this practice is known to have occurred until the 1960s, especially in the villages and uneducated populace, where they fed female babies very hot milk at birth. So it's not so long ago, maybe 60 years ago. Unlearning these types of traditions has been part of our process of becoming a civilized human society. So my dear friends, culture and traditions go hand in hand. And to this day, certain cultures are also very harsh and oppressive where women are concerned, for example. And it's common in so many cultures. They encourage the males to treat the females as subservient, blatantly and subtly and through the dynamic of families. And this is one of the reasons why so many marriages in such cultures fail. Because the women of today will not put up with it, rightly so. So the men in such cases have to unlearn what they have been taught by their parents and grandparents. And this is finally happening, fortunately. In the same context, there are some extreme and dangerous traditions that need to be urgently unlearned and deconstructed, such as honor killings, for example. And unfortunately, the perpetrators of honor killings genuinely believe that what they are doing is right. The tradition and cultural pressure on them is so high that they actually inflict so much harm on the very people, the very children they have raised. So again, this is something that needs to be deconstructed, and thank God, this tradition is finally breaking down through laws and social education. And as it breaks down, unlearning occurs, deconstruction of that occurs, replaced by something better and positive. Now, some traditions may start with an understandable basis. For example, I've heard that at one time, for a Maasai male to get married, he had to go by himself in the bush and kill a lion and bring back its head. Poor guy. It was part of the culture. Poor lion too, but it was part of the culture, which basically demanded and underpinned their fearlessness, something they needed to survive in the harsh forests. And therefore they inculcated that in the young man particularly, and made it part of also their qualification to wed. So it was all about being fearless. So there was a reason for this practice, and it may have served them well at the time. But now this has changed. The danger is gone. And thankfully for the young man and the lions, they don't have to do that anymore. They have to fall in love and get married like everyone else. Now, you know, the Maasais, because of this fearlessness, have developed an amazing identity. I remember, going on safari, and when our kids were younger, safari was part of our family hobby. And at one time we were in this national park, and we were watching these cheetahs. Now, cheetahs are animals you have to be very careful about, because lions and all other cats, that species, they will attack if they are hungry, or they will attack if they are threatened. A cheetah will do it anyway, regardless. So we're watching them, and all of a sudden these 4 cheetahs stand up and they run like pussycats. And we look behind them, and there's a Maasai walking. And he saw them, but he couldn't be bothered to change his path. He walked straight at them, and they were gone. So even the animal kingdom, with cheetahs as well, knows that these beings are fearless. So that was their tradition. That's how it played out. So if we take a step back today and look at human civilization, sadly, we are still quite primitive, despite our education and scientific progress. And some of this primitive nature actually stems from our inability to unlearn and deconstruct. It often takes us generations to achieve this. You sometimes have to wait for an entire generation to be gone before that change comes. Why? Why can it not be a dynamic process? So how do we proceed from here? So each one of us needs to consider the question, in what way is my behavior and way of thinking governed by my culture, tradition, and beliefs? We have to look within, and we have to look at how our views of things, how much are they governed by culture, traditions, and beliefs? And what are their positive traits? And what are their negative traits? And which ones of them are of an extreme nature, requiring urgent change? It's a great process of introspection. And this is where a very honest dialogue has to occur with the intellect. And we must be willing to let go of the parts that need to be chiseled out with great humility. The biggest barrier to this change, and the hardest part of the rock, is the ego. This is why the sculptor sometimes dips his or her sculpture in water for a while, so as to soften the surface, to make it a little more amenable to the sculpturing process. So let's give the ego a good dip, so that you can see the way forward with humility. When it comes to beliefs, religious or otherwise, it is a very, very sensitive area indeed, because we all hold our beliefs very precious. And we can easily be offended or offend others by challenging beliefs. When I was little, I was quite mischievous. And many of the older ladies, particularly my maternal grandmother, would tell me off, saying that one day I would be thrown in the fire by God. Now I visualize someday I would be like a hamburger on that fire. Now fortunately, I did not believe them at face value. But I did have a perception of God being a very angry guy, till I discovered the opposite later in life, that He is pure love and light, nothing but love and light. But I realized that much later in life. Some of my friends at the time truly believed in this fire threat, and they were terrified. Now, what a relief they must have felt when they unlearned all this. And I can also understand where the old ladies were coming from, though, because I've read many of the scriptures, the key ones, some partially and some entirely. And these books were written in the context of thousands of years ago. Now, thousands of years ago, let's say 2,000 years ago, the human intellect only understood, remember, they were savage, they were barbaric when these scriptures came. They only understood reward and punishment. So if you tried to reason with the being of that time, you would get nowhere. So they were told, if you do good, everything good's going to happen, you're going to go to a beautiful place, you're made for eternity. But if you do bad things, you're going in the fire. So the human mind of that time could understand reward and punishment. But then the world changed. So scripture-based teaching and beliefs are meant to evolve with time. And we have to interpret their messages accordingly. Now, these elderly ladies, God bless their souls, only remembered what they were taught as kids, that there's a fire. But it wasn't about, so for them, they took it very literally, and then they passed it to our generation. Fortunately, we didn't pass it on to the next generation. So, when you take graced, blessed scriptures, you have to also ask yourself, what was the context at that time? And what can I draw from it today that fits the context of my world today? Because those messages are eternal. They are ever evolving based on how our intellect is used to interpret them. Now let us look at rituals, for example. And again, we talk of ways of thinking, we talk of beliefs. Some people are highly ritualistic. And, there's a young member of our family. If you look at him, he's about 6'6" tall. He's really tough. But he's highly superstitious. And one day we were driving from home into town, and it was evening, and we had to get somewhere. And all of a sudden, he breaks in the middle of the road. And I said, what happened? And he lives in Kenya. I said, what happened? He said, oh, a black cat crossed the road. I said, good. Is it still on the road? No, it's not. Well, let's keep going. He said, no, I have to turn back. I took one look at him, and I said, you really believe that? He goes, yeah, I have to turn back. He was about 50 times the size of the cat. He turned back. We missed getting there on time because a cat crossed the road. So superstition, and like that, there are many people who believe in so many of these things, but it's time to unlearn them, especially because you begin to realize that they're not relevant today. Some rituals, are very helpful, and some rituals become an impediment. An example is, when you're learning to dance, you have to learn the steps. So you move your left leg forward, right leg behind, A, B, C, you learn the steps. That's a ritual that helps you learn how to dance. But then once you have learned to dance and you start to flow with the music, you have to let that ritual go. because now you want to flow with the music. And in trying to flow with the music, if you're worried about where your foot is going next, you have lost the dance. So a good ritual is one that is self-diminishing, as the pupil has learned. But again, ways of thinking, beliefs, rituals plays a big part as well in how we govern ourselves. So we have to think about that. Are all the rituals we practice relevant to our lives today? If they are, great, we keep going on. If they're not, perhaps we replace them with something more relevant. It's an individual, personal choice. And this is where, in my first book, Reflections from the Origin, I wrote about a sparrow and a dove. And this sparrow has seen the whole world. The sparrow has flown over the green fields. He has flown over a lake where the water glitters and, it's a big, deep lake. He's flown over that. He's flown over a snow-capped peak, mountain. He's flown over the desert. And after, some time he lands on a baobab tree. Now, most of us know the baobab tree. It's very unique. Those who don't, look it up. It's a tree with a huge trunk, grows very tall, and often you're going to have leaves on one side of the tree and no leaves on another side. Same tree, it looks like barren and full of leaves on one side. So while this sparrow is sitting on the baobab tree, a dove comes. And he's a curious fellow, this sparrow. So he says to the dove, where do you live? Above which land is your home? So the dove, being a wise bird, said, to me all lands are equal, and they are all the earth. And the sparrow goes, no. He said, my home is above the green grass, and that's the only earth there is. So that land is the earth. So the dove thought, let me question him a little bit. So the dove says, well, have you seen the land that glitters in the sun, and then when the sun sets, it's just like a deep, dark, lonely land? The sparrow goes, yeah, I've been there. And he said, and I've even tried to stand on it, but my feet go into it. He said, that land is false. It's not real because I can't stand on it. That can never be the earth. So the dove goes, okay. He said, have you flown over, have you seen this brown land, which is very hot? He was referring to the desert. And the sparrow goes, yes, I have. And when I tried to land on it, my feet got burnt. I felt a lot of pain. This is a very harsh land. It can't be real. It can't be the earth. This land is one you keep away from. Okay, so that's not the earth. So the dove says, have you seen the land where on the top of the mountain which touches the sky? And the sparrow goes, yes, I've been there. And when I see it from far, that land is touching the sky. When I get above it, the sky is still very far away, so that land always lies. And when I land on it, on that white fluffy stuff, I feel the same pain as I do when I stand on that, that hot sand, but it's a different kind of pain. So he said, this land always lies. It can never be the earth. So then the dove says, okay, so what is the earth then? He said, the green grass, the land where I come from, that's the only earth. So he said, okay, do you agree that we're standing on a tree, on a baobab tree? So the sparrow goes, of course, I'm standing on this baobab tree. So the dove says, look on this side, do you see leaves? He says, yes. He says, look on that side, no leaves. So one side is leaves, one side is barren. Would you say we're standing on two trees? And the sparrow goes, you may have a point, but no, this is one tree. I'm standing on it. I know it's one tree. But, he said, I may buy your story of the baobab tree, but when it comes to really what is the earth, you doves need to be sparrows to really know what the earth is. So there you go. Wide perspectives, ways of thinking, a wise bird, a well-traveled bird, a bird with a very firm set of beliefs and thinking, another one flexible as ever. This story projects to you. And most of us, I think, when we live with the intellect, we become like the doves, even though we may have started off as sparrows, or still have some traits of sparrows left in us, but we aspire to be like the doves. And that comes from unlearning and deconstructing some of our beliefs. And that's not a bad thing. We should do that. If that sparrow deconstructed his view of the earth, he would have become like the dove. So when we unlearn and deconstruct some of our beliefs, we can restore them in our beings in a form that is more in keeping with our times and way of life. We have to have the honesty and courage to do that. This brings us to the fourth aspect, which is, and this is a difficult one, this is the aspect of etched past experiences. Because each one of us harbors hurt from our life's journey, whatever the cause. These hurts are deeply etched, hidden, and unforgiven. They are a source of great pain for us. And even when these etched scars are touched, we react in ways that inflict a great amount of pain upon others. Certain events of the past may have shaped our attitudes in a very negative way. So they remain trigger points for our fears. They unleash anger within us that are totally abnormal to our nature. So I think you can see what I mean here. These deeply rooted, etched things of the past that we have experienced lie buried there, but they surface in very, very destructive ways sometimes. And we have to go back to them very gently. When we see them surface in our thoughts and reactions, we have to question ourselves, why did I react that way? It goes back to something that happened. And then seek to forgive that. And also seek to be forgiven. Seek to heal them through contemplation and self-reasoning. Use the intellect to process them and let them go. For a sculptor, they are chips that don't belong. They have to be chiseled out very carefully and then healed through fine polishing. Meditation can also be very helpful in healing these deeply etched scars and predispositions. But there also is an opportunity to unlearn through forgiveness, through healing, through meditation. Which brings me to the final part, which is our benchmarks and judgments. Now, by now we've developed some understanding of what makes up our benchmarks. They include our way of thinking, our opinions and attitudes, our culture, traditions, and beliefs, and our etched past experiences. All these make up our benchmark. They make up the yardstick by which we see others and judge them accordingly. But we also realize now that our benchmarks can be wrong, sometimes very wrong. Some of them need to be chiseled out. So if we start questioning our own benchmark and then break it down and reconstruct it as needed, we will begin to view others differently. We will communicate with them differently. And the chances are very high that we may be able to increase harmony in our lives exponentially. Our benchmark is like our eyeglasses. If your glasses are too dark, you will see the world one way. And the world will also see you that way because your eyes have a dark shield, making you obscure to them. If your eyeglasses are transparent, you will see a different world. And the world will see you differently. It will connect with you and the beauty and sincerity of your eyes. You won't be obscure. You will be clear. So a good sculptor always makes sure he or she is wearing clean eyeglasses, which are as transparent as possible. My dear friends, in conclusion, I hope we have shone a spotlight on the importance of unlearning and deconstruction. We all want to shape our sculpture to the very best of our ability. We all want to shine our rough diamond that we started out as and become the brightest of gems in the universe. So let us start this journey today. I believe the experiences we will have through this new mindset can be truly enriching. And the memories we will create are going to be treasures we leave behind. And I pray you may all be blessed with great success and happiness in your journey of self-refinement, materially and spiritually.